Former minister and founder of Something or Other Publishing, Wade Franson is the host of Created in the Image of God, a series that examines the role of religion in society, from messianic returns to the emotive responses transmitted through our culture. Wade fearlessly addresses reality claims from all directions, objectively exploring their compatibility with Holy Scripture. Tonight's episode, The Meaning of Free Will, with George Musser.
Hi, everyone. I'm your host, Wade Franson, and this is Created in the Image of God. I'd like to welcome all our friends in the audience for a very exciting episode, one that I have been waiting for a very long time. Some of you know that I began writing my trilogy around the time I subscribed to Scientific American, or at least the ideas that went into that came from subscribing to Scientific American and beginning to open up my religious theological ideas to scientific evidence and to the reality of what the world's leading scientists were discovering and representing in those pages every month. And I read it religiously, pun intended. And in my final book in the trilogy, The Rod of Iron, I referenced a couple of those articles on cosmology that led to the initial rush of inspiration to do that trilogy. So imagine my honor, the honor that I feel at having tonight's guest, George Musser, who worked with that magazine and whose work I uncovered in that magazine. I can't wait just to get into the topic for tonight. So let's bring Bruce into the studio.
Hello, everyone.
And I just called you Bruce. Sorry, George.
I'll be Bruce if you need me to be Bruce, but I'm honored to be here. I'm honored that you had such kind words about my past work.
Right. So we're going to dive into that. As our guests, as our audience knows, we always look at the creation story of our guests, right? So how were you formed and shaped? Tell us a little bit about your parents, where they came from, where they settled, and that petri dish that produced you, the culture that produced you in those very early formative years before you took charge sort of your own destiny as you then came of age.
Yeah, well, origin stories are funny because we form them looking backward, and we try to connect dots that at the time really were more random than anything, but I'll do what I can there. I was actually born in Houston and moved when I was very, very young to New Jersey. Actually, I'm speaking to you from New Jersey now. I've kind of cycled in the strange ways life has back near to where I grew up. My dad went to Rice University and my mom worked the French consulate in Houston, and they met around the time of the Kennedy assassination, actually, but I don't know the full story. And my dad took a position as a research engineer for Esso, now Exxon. They have something akin to a Bell Labs, actually not too far from here, where they studied petrochemicals and such like. I tend not to tell people my dad worked for Exxon these days. It has a different reputation. But in the 70s and 80s, they were really where it's at in terms of coming up with understanding of chemistry and indeed of Earth's climate as well. They did some of the early work on climate change. And my dad actually worked on pollution control devices that were installed. And I think they still exist in most people's cars, most people's gas cars, if you have a gas car. And my mom was at home taking care of my brother and me, but then went back and as an adult and got her law degree. So we're educated household, I guess you could see, from all the books behind me as well. My mom was Catholic, and I was raised in that tradition. Somewhere over here is the Bible I got when I was confirmed. And I have to confess, though, I kind of went off organized religion as I was going into my 20s. So I'm still trying to understand the deep nature reality, but I try not to do it through an organized faith at this point. So I think an important formative experience for me was living overseas. My dad was posted to Tehran. We were living there before the revolution took place in the 70s. And that opened my eyes to a lot of things personally and what later became my chosen profession. We lived in England as well under similar, not before the revolution, but under similar circumstances where my dad was establishing a research laboratory. So I went to college, actually a double major in mathematics and engineering. And then took a couple years to collect my thoughts. I did some traveling. I traveled the length of Africa, backpacking, hitchhiking. And then I went to graduate school in planetary science. So I'm actually a card-carrying astronomer, but my specialty was on the planet Venus, in the planet Venus. And we can talk about
Wow.
Venus if you like later. My knowledge is a bit dated, but still was my first kind of academic love, you could say. But when I was in graduate school, maybe this is more apropos of the origin story that you want, I began to realize I had such diverse interests, and they were better served by looking at the broad picture of science. And then I discovered that there's a profession that does exactly that, which is called science writing, science journalism, science popularization, if you will. Instead of deep diving down the academic silo, as you would as a PhD scientist, you go broad. You look at the big questions, the kind of big capital B, capital Q questions that science tends to address. It verges on philosophy as well, social, improving social conditions and bringing technology to the benefit of humanity. And I worked for 4 years at a startup, not a startup because they're really a nonprofit group in San Francisco. Startup implies they were trying to make money, and they certainly weren't. Nonprofit group out there. And then I was invited to apply. I was honored to apply to Scientific American and started working there in 1998. And we'll come back because that's a very important year in the history of cosmology.
Awesome.
And I
Well, I'm
worked.
gonna push the pause button right there
Push to
because
pause away.
I'm fascinated by so many things you said, and I love those early formative years. So, and it helps me then understand some of the underlying things going on. And I've done a lot of analysis on this myself because of my dramatic, turbulent, experiences as a child, and I understand how deep some of those things affect our perspectives and our views. So the first thing that I'm interested in is your mother working at the French embassy and your name Musser. So where does that name come from? Is that your mother's maiden name by any chance? Is your father's name? It just sounds a little French to me, maybe, and that's why I'm curious.
It's actually a German name, but you're perceptive because it was the border region between basically Switzerland, Germany, and France. So yes, there
So down
may
there
well
near
be a.
Basel somewhere, and I actually was a pastor in that area. Stuttgart, Zurich, and Basel was my three
Oh
church
wow.
circuit, and I traveled extensively in that area. I lived in France briefly in the Alsace region, in Strasbourg, and yeah, I could tell stories, but this isn't about me. But so, yes, very interesting.
I'd love to hear those stories. So it was actually umlauted originally when that name came to the U.S. It was through my father's family, Musser,
Yeah,
M-O umlaut, and then there was no Ellis Island, but effectively also an Anglicization of the name took place. And there's Mussers around. There's a branch of the family out in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. There's a Musser Marimba company, although I'm not connected with that. So there's
So,
some
so
Mussers
your
here, and
so
there's
your dad
not a
was of
common name though.
Your dad was of German heritage, but how did your mother end up at the French embassy then?
Actually, my dad was of a mongrel heritage. The name is Germanic, but I'm part Irish. You can
Yeah,
probably tell from my hair. Um, we're all over, traced back to the Mayflower through part of the family too.
nice.
So my mom um, who's actually Czech. She's now, I guess, would be third generation U.S. but Czech descent. Um, I don't actually know her story. Why she studied French in college and got a job at the French consulate in Houston, and speaks highly of it. But you never actually told me why she went there. So this is the question I'll have to ask her. My dad unfortunately passed away some years back, so I
Mm,
don't know
okay.
all that story. But my mom's still around, so I'll ask her. I'll
Yeah.
ask her that.
So then the next question I had was all that traveling, and indeed you're then backpacking even as you were coming of age. Um, was it just general curiosity? Was it the thing to do? Were you interested in languages, uh, culture? What were some of the driving factors of that? Obviously you'd been in Tehran. I wanted to get into that as well, but yeah. So your travel and
Well,
your international experience, how did that form and shape you?
Yeah, so I guess, I mean, I'm generally curious, always have been, and the travel probably mostly that, but there's a self kind of actualization element to it too,
Mhm.
where you're, at the time, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I had multiple interests. I think I wanted to be a writer back then. Uh, Ironically, I did become that, but not through the path I expected. So part of
So it's
my
more like a
traveling,
Jack Kerouac kind of thing, or
yeah, I was very influenced by Kerouac. I love Kerouac even now. I read the kind of the new version, the one from the Vellum. So yeah, I don't know if there's a single reason for it. I was fascinated by Africa in particular. I'm fascinated by lots of things. You'll probably find in the course of this conversation. There's very few things I'm not fascinated by. But Africa was among them. So I found in the college bookstore Africa on a Shoestring, and it's in the Lonely Planet series.
Mhm.
And somewhere I've still got that book. I later contributed to it, actually, some of my own findings or recommendations, I guess you could say. Today it's easy. You go on, Google, Airbnb, TripAdvisor, and you can leave your reviews and so forth. You can find information easily. But I'm talking about the mid '80s here, and you'll remember this. Traveling is much more by the seat of your pants. And when
Absolutely.
I traveled, I was gone. I had no contact with my family for weeks at a time. I sent telegrams. I'm probably dating myself, but actually still had telegrams. You could send telegrams, and they were the
Well, and
easiest
I remember when the
way.
fax machine came out, and you could stop at the German office and send a fax machine from there, right?
Yeah, I went to the American Express offices in the different countries I went to, cashed a check there, and then anyway, so it was a different
Exactly.
world, and I like
Yeah.
that kind of presence in a place without kind of being pulled back to where you're from. Although I'm sure it was terrible. Being a parent now, God, to go through that, I can't imagine what my parents went through, but it certainly shaped me.
Yep. So that's actually perhaps a good segue then. The dramatic rise in technology. It's mind blowing when you think about it. In that we're sitting here talking about the '80s, we both experienced it, and there was no internet, there were no cell phones. You had a fax machine. If you were lucky, you would get an answer before you needed it, right? From somewhere. I remember trying to coordinate things internationally, a few big meetings and stuff, and it was very, very challenging. Um, but we're gonna go to the first commercial break now, which is actually going to be um, a video about your book, putting ourselves back into the equation. Is that the title of it?
In the
Putting,
equation, but yeah, into works too.
yeah. So we're gonna look at a quick video of that book, and when we come back, we're gonna start talking about your work at Scientific American and how we got into this topic of consciousness, free will, and talk a little bit about your work and your further curiosity in exploring some of these topics as you then began to develop that through Scientific American and on deeper into this topic. So for the audience, don't go anywhere. Appreciate those comments that you're beginning to put in the chat. We'll come to them later in the show. But for now, we'll go to this quick commercial break and be back to learn more about George Musser's work.
For centuries, physicists have sought to explain the universe, from the grand dance of galaxies to the invisible world of subatomic particles. But what happens when the act of observation itself changes what we see? When consciousness, the very thing that makes us observers, becomes part of the equation. Physicists have found that the lines between the observer and the observed are blurred, making consciousness a puzzle they cannot ignore. To unlock the mysteries of the cosmos, they must understand the workings of the mind. This book explores the deep interconnections between quantum mechanics, cosmology, and human consciousness. Can the structure of the brain reveal the secrets of the universe? Can the laws of physics help us understand the nature of our own awareness? Join George Musser on a journey to the cutting edge of science, where the quest for a theory of everything meets the profound mysteries of the human mind. Could understanding the universe start with understanding ourselves? Putting Ourselves Back in the Equation by George Musser. Available now.
Wow. I can't wait to dive into that book. Full confession, I haven't read it yet. But as you and I were talking earlier, it was that idea of looking at the world, looking at the universe rather through these studies. But we do so in anthropomorphic terms, in that we're really looking for answers to questions about ourselves, where we're going, where we came from, our own makeup, what is the self, and but we're looking for answers even as we look into the furthest reaches of the universe. And you talked about, rather than going deep, you became a science journalist, or into journalism, to try to make some of those things accessible. And this book seems like a big step in that direction. So tell us a little bit about this book and what you've accomplished in it, what you're hoping to accomplish, and what you hope people will get out of it.
So the book, this latest book, like all my projects, has its own backstory. Really came out of my previous book, which was more on quantum, focusing more on quantum physics. And of course, of working on that book, the questions of observers kept coming up. And I decided I needed to kind of dive into that. And at the same time, and I talk a little bit about the origin of this in the kind of introduction to the book, but to recount, I go to a lot of conferences. I love going to conferences. It's fun to meet people and hear what they have to say. And you have these after hours conversations in bars, restaurants, just walking around. And the physicists, the cosmologists, the different physical scientists I talked to kept bringing up questions and topics that didn't seem in their wheelhouse. They kept bringing up consciousness. They kept bringing up, maybe not consciousness exactly, but perception, things that are traditionally associated with neuroscience or cognitive psychology and the humanities and other domains as well. So I was just curious, what was the source of their interest in these domains, and basically the one way you might put it is that the puzzles, paradoxes, mysteries of the universe, of the physical universe, have important ties to puzzles, paradoxes, etc., of our own minds, and vice versa. So we have a physical form. So at that simple level, we have to reconcile our own processes of thought and feeling and so forth with the physical world. So maybe that's the obvious direction, that in order to understand our brains and our minds that are in our kind of produced by our brains, we should understand physical law and physical science in general. And then the other direction is maybe the more surprising one, and that's, I spend most of the time in the book talking about that, which is, why would an understanding of neuroscience, cognitive psychology, mental interiority be important to understanding physics? Because physics seems to bleach that out. It doesn't really seem to have a role for the subjective element. And it turns out that is important in certain fundamental questions. And those fundamental questions also are becoming more and more pressing as we go on. The questions of theories of everything. What does that mean? Kind of create a unified theory.
In your view, why are they more pressing as we go on?
Yeah, so it's more the nature of the questions that are being asked. So over the course of the history of science, it's kind of started with the low-hanging fruit, picking out what, at least in retrospect, it seems, are the easier questions of how do things move. Can you predict the path of a baseball when you throw it? Can you predict the orbit of a planet? These turn out to be, though complicated, fairly straightforward. There are known laws, measurements you can make. You take the measurements, you apply the laws, you can predict where things will be in the future. You can predict solar eclipses down to the microsecond through that in a way that was impossible 5 centuries ago. So, but as science goes on, one way to put it is it's a victim of its own success. So every time a scientific discovery is made, of an advance is pushed forward, it makes the next advance that much harder. It means you're going that much deeper into nature. So then you have to go into the understanding of fields, electric fields, magnetic fields, gravitational fields. How do they arise? You get to the quantum physics. And as you push deeper and deeper, those questions that have been bracketed, questions of subjective experience start to intrude again. So they weren't really necessary. You don't really need to know about how do brains work to understand how planets move, but to understand how particles
your
behave.
observation of the planet might in some way change something, but
It does.
ultimately, but ultimately, it doesn't really change the planet's trajectory.
It does, but to such a minute degree with
Exactly,
something like a planet.
exactly.
And there's fascinating issues with planetary
But then,
motion. I'm not going to.
as we get into more subtle issues, more complex issues.
Exactly. So it's not across the board. Not every science needs to have a human element in it or a subjective, an understanding of subjective experience in it, but some do. And the ones I talk about in the book include free will. So that's the topic of our session today, but also quantum physics has spent a lot of effort on understanding where the relation of quantum physics and consciousness occurs. Turns out cosmology on its grandest scales also needs this, and there's some other questions of causation. The nature of time is another one. So these are foundational questions that aren't really necessary for earlier developments in science, but they're necessary today because we were trying to pull together everything into a single theory of everything. Should I go on, or I'm happy to?
You should.
We're getting
I
a
was
lot of good
just, I
questions,
was
by the
just,
way. They're coming up on the side here.
yeah, I was just reflecting on. I read this article years ago, and I was looking up the name of the person in Scientific American, and I'm thinking it was Fiona, but I can't remember the first name. Marco Polos, and she
Oh,
proved she was
Fortini
a
Marco Polo, yes.
she. What was the first name again?
Fortini.
14. Yes, that's it. That's right. Not Fiona. And she proved mathematically that something doesn't exist until it's observed. At least that's my recollection of the article. And so I was just sort of correlating your research and your experience with that discovery that affected me profoundly when I learned of that. I have no idea how somebody proves such a thing mathematically, but I do trust that there are people who can do such things, right?
So I'm not familiar with that work of Fortini's. Fortini was a major figure in my previous book, the one that came out in 2005 on quantum physics. 2015, excuse me, on quantum physics. But and her kind of core insight that's kind of propelled her career is that we are part of the universe. We're part of the thing that we are trying to study. And a part can't take in the whole. It's just,
Right.
it's
I
because it's
remember in
including
theology
itself.
the discussion about the nature of God and that whole thing about anyway. But go ahead. That was
Yeah, and
another
this is
fun fact. Go ahead.
a fundamental question I've also talked about in the current book, that
Because
we're
God doesn't
part.
have parts, right? And God doesn't have parts. Anyway, go.
Yeah, and certainly not physical parts. So,
Right.
but we mortal creatures are part of the universe. We're a very small part, both in spatial and temporal terms, and that creates limitations or creates a lens through which we observe the universe, and we need to be aware of that. We need to not assume that we're seeing the universe from some perspective other than our own perspective. And science sometimes forgets that. Science seeks an objective or observer independent view of the world, and such a thing really isn't possible. We can approach it, but ultimately the observer does need to be considered.
Well, and I've kind of flipped the script on that philosophically, in that and this is what occurred to me, and I'm going to maybe derail the conversation, but maybe this is interesting in light of your book. So, if indeed something doesn't exist unless it's observed, then thought experiment for those who don't believe in God. When God said, "Let there be light," and there was light, he observed a thing and then it was. It was brought into being because there was a primary observer, right? You might, whatever, whether we call it consciousness, God, whatever we call it, there was some observation made and thus things were called into being. So the title of this show is Created in the Image of God. If we each view a thing subjectively, are we then not each one of us creating our own independent parallel universe by observing what is differently? Does the act of a unique human observing things actually generate the creation of a parallel universe?
Yeah, maybe not a parallel universe, but our own universe. And actually, there's a physicist up at UMass in Boston who has a very nice way of formulating that creation is ongoing. The creation of the physical universe is ongoing, and every quantum event contributes to that, and we contribute to that quantum event. So we're recapitulating the first stages of Genesis in that way. And Genesis is it's a story that is worth examining and retelling multiple times because it's staged. God in that story doesn't bring the universe full cloth into being. It's a staged process. It happens little by little. And the starts with the definition of a category, light and dark. And that is also this question of the categories also comes up in quantum physics. Quantum physics, absent the human or the, maybe not a human necessarily, the sentient being, let's say, does not establish categories. The categories are done by the observer, or by the interaction the observer has with that system. There's different ways of looking at it. So these abstractions, these categories aren't don't pre-exist us in a way. So not only, so that I think this is one way to put it, is not only do we bring things into being, we bring things into being with a certain structure, and those two go together. We can't just create being. It can't just be some raw amorphous being. It has to be something that has, in the primordial example, a structure of light and dark. It's not just being, it's light and dark. So it creates a distinction, and then other distinctions are later on top of that.
Yeah, it's differentiated.
Differentiated, exactly. And that happens with these questions in quantum mechanics as well. I talk about what I call the menu problem, technically known as the preferred basis problem in quantum theory. It's one of the big questions of why the categories we observe. Why do things have positions? Why is position an important category? Why is momentum an important category? And there's others as well. And there's a theory for how that happens.
So when you mention those terms, I'm thinking now classical physics, right? Because obviously those terms have meaning in classical physics, but they also have a meaning in what's the word I'm looking for? In our realm, right? Like we can have momentum, and our momentum is different from a physical object's momentum. You follow me? A movie can have momentum in its popularity, right? The word conceive is also interesting, right? In terms of origin story, right? And we conceive of things. These words have different meanings in these different contexts. So when you get to the book of Genesis and you start talking about it, and I love your reinterpretation of it, it's a living thing, right? That needs to be reinterpreted, that needs to be looked at with fresh eyes. So I might be useful to add, you're probably aware, I think many in our audience are aware, there are actually two creation stories. There's two parallel creation stories. There's Genesis 1, which goes maybe through Genesis chapter 1. There's the first creation story, which goes through chapter 1 and a few other verses. It's where does the first one start and the second one end? But then you have the story of the creation of man, and now you have a human-centric view, whereas the other one is sort of a divine out in space looking at the creation of the planet. But now from within the planet, we see creation unfolding, and man is offered the opportunity to participate in that creation by talking about the differentiation of the animal kingdom and giving it a name, right? Naming the animals. To me, that's one of the most profound pieces of that whole story, is the introduction of this observant being, this conscious being, who's now co-creating by giving names to these animals and adding our own fingerprints, if you will, to that.
And there's a lot in there to unpack and to reflect on as well. So one is that the act of naming kind of creates a model of the world in the sense of a miniaturized representation of the world inside our heads, inside our minds. So our minds reflect the exterior world, and that this is the basis of many modern theories of consciousness. And how does consciousness, what does it mean to be a conscious being? And in the scientific sense, philosophical as well, but certainly scientific one, is usually the creation of models. And the naming is that. Then there's the question of that the world can be subdivided and names given. Maybe it's obvious in terms of animal species. Actually, I just read an article in the New Yorker about Linnaeus and how in his time in the 18th century it was not obvious that one could partition the world so neatly into species and the other levels of taxonomy. But in physics, naming is the first really act of any science. Is often physicists disparage it as stamp collecting, but you do have to collect the stamps before you can kind of process them. And once you've done your initial naming, you can go through and see patterns in the world. Anyway, I'm going on and on about this, but I think there's a lot. Yeah.
I think some of the most complex problems that we as a species are facing today arise from the fact that names are being used, i.e. labels, right? And that these labels have meaning that is grossly differentiated, right? Amongst contending peoples who cannot reach agreement on anything. They're putting their spin on everything, which is, of course, interesting in the whole quantum. I don't mean to get too vague and fuzzy here, but let's now go down back into the science for a minute. So in your book, you're talking about consciousness, the emergence of consciousness and free will and some of those concepts. So tell us what some of those deep dive scientific discoveries are that you are maybe not popularizing, but seeking to interpret or explain to the layman, or maybe you're trying to begin to fit pieces of a puzzle into that theory of everything that was mentioned in that video.
So, there's so many, and I do want to get back to free will, but let me diverge again back into quantum physics, because I think
Sure.
When let's pick apart some of the things or we were alluding to earlier, and maybe talk about that a little bit. So and I'm going to go through this quickly, and we can come back with questions later if anyone feels they're losing the thread here. I'll try to pick it up later and help you guys. But in certain situations in quantum physics, one can have a particle, usually it's a particle, but can be anything. We'll just call it a particle, in an indeterminate state. So it can be, we call it a superposition state. It can be, the usual example is like people talk about the Schrödinger cat. It actually isn't done with a cat, but you can think of it in those terms and then relate it back to the particles. The cat is alive and dead. That might correspond to a particle having its spin oriented up or down. And the funny thing is that the cat can be alive and dead at the same time, or maybe a better way of putting it, it's neither alive nor dead. It's in some other state that somehow combines those two features. So this is routine with particles. In fact, the light coming from light bulbs and other processes in nature, really everything that's all around us that we're not aware of it, is also in this indeterminate state of being in mutually conflicting options.
So I'll pause you there for a second, because I've obviously, if you've been reading for a while, Schrödinger's cat, hugely important, but I've never really, strangely, this is new to me to just simply say it's a different state, right? It's not both alive and dead. Those are constructs that we use to understand. It's something else that we don't yet fully understand. We don't fully understand it. It's a different state. That to me is really helpful.
It's also a subtle point, and maybe is muddying the waters if they're coming into this for the first time. It's easiest to think of the cat as being alive and dead. in this combination of those two conflicting options. But the big and a very important footnote that you're getting at is that the cat could be in some other binary opposition. The very same cat, it's really our description that's being imposed here. We've imposed these two categories of alive and dead, but you might impose some other categories, and they would correspond to a little bit alive and a little bit dead, and a little bit alive minus a little bit dead, or something like that. And again, relating it back to particles, because maybe that makes it less mysterious. In that case, the particle, which originally was either spin up or spin down, might be spin sideways, and spin sideways to the right, spin sideways to the left. Yeah, so it gets a little puzzling and weird when we talk about cats being in this state, because we assume that they have to be either alive or dead. But it turns out with a particle, there's actually an infinity of categories. And this goes back to, remember I said earlier that the defining kind of creative act is the invention of a category. And that's what happens in quantum physics too. But anyway, let's take the alive and dead cat. It's in the box. As these things are often put in boxes for whatever reason. Box represents kind of an isolation for the observer. We open the box, we look, and we see the cat alive or dead. And the great puzzle of quantum physics is why alive and dead got turned into alive or dead. What happened there? Why do we see it just in one state or the other, not in this kind of indeterminate or ambiguous state of the two? And this seems to involve, or it manifestly does involve, the act of observation. Now, why would the observer's intrusion into opening the box and looking at the cat cause the cat to snap into one of these two states? That's what's called the measurement problem. It's not fully understood to this day. In fact, huge debates over this, sometimes quite ill-tempered debates, can arise over this question. People assume they have the answer. And I have talked about this in our past discussions. People need to be a bit more humble and recognize that there are multiple ways looking at the same situation. However, my own view, and I try not to, when I discuss these things in my book, I try to present a range of options and not be too. A lot of professors, for instance, would say it must be this, and they kind of sit you down and they lecture you. I'm kind of more like, well, it could be this, it could be this. I give you a set of options, and the choice is ultimately up to you, the intelligent reader. Having said that, I do have an opinion. My opinion is that the aliveness or deadness of the cat is an artifact of our own nature, of our own observation. And the fact that, like Fotini argued, as you pointed out, we cannot stand outside the cat. Whenever we interact with the cat in its ambiguous state, we come to be connected to that cat. We come to share its ambiguous state. And through a chain of reasoning I can go into later if you want, that leads us to think the cat has snapped to being alive or dead. It actually hasn't. We've snapped to seeing the cat as alive or dead. It's a statement about us, not about the cat. Okay, I just threw a lot at you guys. You're very patient for putting up with me on this, but the point being that the nature of observation comes into our quantum experiments.
So this is wonderful. This is like reading those articles that you were editing in the early 2000s and later articles you were contributing, but with a real live person sharing it. And there's a certain energy that is actually activating perhaps more processing power. So I'm going to react to this by asking a couple of questions that occurred to me. One is, so you've got the nature of what we are as a species, which we've said, look, all this scientific exploration and the massive human project of all of our collective energies and consciousness is trying to figure out who we are, where we came from, where we're going. Because we're a part of it and we can't extract ourselves from it, we're trying to understand our place in the universe and how we fit into it and our relationship with it. But what's unique about us, again, in the context of this show, that particular box that is this show, created in the image of God, is that there's some higher purpose, and it has to do with, again, going back to the Genesis story where we were given a choice. We're given a choice, and later in the book of Exodus, I believe it is, that choice is reiterated, or Deuteronomy, it says, I set before you today life and death. Therefore, choose life. Choose life. A lot was written about this recently in the Jewish experience, Holocaust and all this. Choose life, the Jewish race having to choose life despite all, to choose life. My point being that there's something about our nature, the nature of what we are, that we're making that choice. We're the first entity on the planet that can consciously choose life or choose death. Joe Atman, who's been on the show and who we invited to the audience. I haven't seen him comment yet, but if you're out there, Joe, please engage. And his book, A Philosophical War, talks about that Garden of Eden story in the context of we're forming concepts as we engage with reality. Those concepts and those constructs are not reality, but we begin to relate to reality through our construction, which is, in that sense, a false God, a false reality. It's a reality inside our head that is not the external reality. We begin to rely more on the reality in our head than actually engaging with reality itself. And we can become delusional in extreme cases. But my point is, there we are. We've been given this power of consciousness. We've been given the opportunity to interact with reality in a new and completely different way than anything else that was created before us, again, in the context of this show. And we always have a choice to make. There's something about how we're constructed that we're being asked, yea, required to make choices. And in that sense, that's maybe why we're interfering with that cat in the box, is because it's the nature of who we are that cat is snapping into a, did you call it a superposition? Because of the nature of who and what we are. And that is, we're going to pollute that free expression of alternative states by engaging with it, even through the act of observation. We're going to permanently alter that situation. It's as said in that movie, was it Rainn Wilson in the movie Juno told Ellen Page, that's one diddle that can't be undid, right? Once we observe the cat, it can't be reversed. So there's a time element, and our choice sort of invokes that collapse of the wave function in classical physics. The bowling ball moves in a different direction because of our interaction with it.
Well, there's a lot there, and to take what the last remark is, it's really the interaction that's the key kind of pressure point in this whole discussion. What is the nature of the interaction that allows the choices that we make, and that might just be abstractions, to gain physical form in the sense of take the cat, that can cause the cat to snap into it, being alive or dead. Then going back again through your remarks, you mentioned that it can't be reversed. Actually, one thing that's distinct about quantum superposition over other forms of multiplicity is that it can be reversed. That's actually the one key difference between the quantum and the classical
the cat
worlds
can be
when it comes down to
resurrected.
this. So yes, you can return the cat to its ambiguous state. And again, maybe it's mysterious when I couch it in terms of cats. How can that happen? But when you translate it to the particles, it's straightforward. You can take the particle and interact with it and cause it to, for instance, go spin up. And then you can reverse that under certain conditions. Of course, this gets complicated, but it can be reversed. And this is shown experimentally that you can actually undo superpositions, return a cat or a particle acting as a cat. If it started spin up, you made it spin up, spin down, you can put it back to spin up. Completely reversible. And that's, again, distinct from the classical case where if I think that the present on the floor contains a drone or the keys to my new car, open it up and it's a drone, I can't close the present down and open it up again, it becomes a keys. It's just once Monty Hall opens up the door and shows what's behind it, the choice is made. And that's the classical choices we make in the world, with exceptions, can't be reversed. And this is, of course, we tell our kids, You know, you got to live with the choices that you make. You can't undo them. In quantum world, you can undo them. And if I have people, I'm seeing a bunch of questions over. They come in my column right here, and you guys are just shooting lots of questions about this, and we'll get to them when we can.
Yeah, well,
okay.
we will circle back and get to some of these questions. Maybe now though is a good time to bring in a couple of them.
Let me just say one other thing that I think kind of frames this whole discussion, goes back to kind of my project in the book. Physics, in addition to kind of bracketing questions of the human experience, also bracketed the question of agency. What does it mean to be a deliberative, action-taking feature of the world? What does that actually mean? We humans are agents, but also other living creatures, maybe some kinds of AI, can be agents. And there's a whole fascinating field of science right now. It hasn't getting a lot of play. I talked about it a little bit, but otherwise it's kind of under the radar, of the science of agency. What does that mean? And one way to think of it is through our vast memories, our experiences, we're pulling together different features of the world that under other circumstances would not be pulled together. When you press a lever in a lab and the other side goes up, it's just a simple reaction. There's nothing else coming into it. You press one side, the other side goes up, with like a seesaw, for example. But the mind works very differently. We're consolidating, we are aggregating, you know, in my case, 58 years of life, of experience into my head in every decision that I make. That's a lineage, that's a history that ordinary physical systems lack. And I think, and there's actually an excellent book by Sarah Walker that talks about the importance of lineage, of history, in understanding life. That life is life because of its history. I think I blacked out for a second. Life is life because of the history that it has.
Well, that gets back to what we were saying a little while ago about words like trajectory and momentum, which take on a whole different meaning when applied to human experience.
But even then, with a single particle, its trajectory is pretty simple. You can actually just retrodict it from where it currently is, considering the forces that might be acting on it and so forth. You can do prediction and retrodiction perfectly. So if you know where the particle is now, you know where it will be in 100 years, you know where it was 100 years ago. Humans aren't like that, of course. We're very twisty. We have weird capacity to take in information from different sides and subject it to different, mostly irrational decision-making, but sometimes rational.
I will throw in a comment here from Bert Lawrence. L.L. Lewis, great point. Interesting how people don't want to be wrong or even possibly apologize if they were possibly wrong while presenting their position. This is maybe one aspect of trajectory or momentum, inertia, right? Those kinds of terms applied to human experience where we can't admit error, we can't admit we're wrong for a whole host of reasons.
Yep. But, looking at the glass being half full on this, sometimes we do. And it's very hard to do, by the way, to apologize, to say that one was wrong and to evolve one's opinion. Hardest thing you can do. But we can. We were capable of doing that. No other certainly inanimate systems, or probably most life, cannot do that. It cannot rethink its trajectory, whereas we humans at least have the potential to. And again, I think that's what defines an agent as a distinct from other kinds of systems in physics. And this is a very cutting edge field right now.
Awesome. Well, we're going to take a quick commercial break because I did see Joe in the audience with a comment. Cool. He has been a guest on the show. We'd like to invite him into this conversation in the future because of his perspective. So I'll just go ahead and air a quick commercial break for his book, A Philosophical War. And when we come back, I'd like to then really get into this idea of free will, right? Because if we start talking about apologizing for being wrong, the concept of agency, do we have agency? Can we have agency if there's no such thing as free will? Maybe get into some of those questions. Don't go in.
Where the battle of minds goes unnoticed, one man dared to challenge the very structure of consciousness itself. Joseph Ottman proudly presents the first part of his groundbreaking collected work, A Philosophical War. Ottman's mission is to expose humanity's most elusive adversary, the structure of its own consciousness. He argues that the modern human condition is plagued by a thought process that inflicts unnecessary suffering. This thought process, like a stealthy enemy, wages war against our nature. Ottman's quest is both daring and revolutionary, to overthrow and replace the current prevailing conscious structure. He identifies the enemy within and seeks a more coherent and powerful ally. With digestible bursts of epistemological guerrilla strikes, he pierces the lines of everyday thought patterns. This counteroffensive offers a new perspective, one that challenges the way we perceive reality. Ottman asserts that humanity's consciousness has relied too heavily on thought alone. He introduces being with, a relationality that harmonizes humanity with the world around us. But the battle doesn't end there. Ottman reinterprets the early chapters of Genesis. He calls for the removal of contemporary notions of God while offering a profound argument for God's existence. Filled with intrigue, simplistic insights, and mystical yet realistic hope, this book is a potential landmark work. A Philosophical War by Joseph Ottman. Available at Amazon.
Wow, I can't wait to read that.
Well, welcome back to Creating the Image of God, everyone. It's Wade Franson, your host, with George Musser from Scientific American fame, author of a book, Putting Ourselves Back into the Equation. We were diving into the concepts of free will and agency. But before we go there, thinking about Joe Ottman, let's just go there. I don't want to derail it further. So tell us a little bit more then about consciousness, free will, agency, some of these ideas you were discussing in the context of your book.
Okay, well, it's a big charge, but let's take for a moment free will, because that was the title of today, and we might as well deliver what we said we would. So free will is a tricky thing, and it's a highly important thing, I should say. It governs our thinking and our actions as human beings day in, day out. It's nature of responsibility, democracy, all these that presumes voters have choices that they make, hopefully freely. So free will comes up a lot, and I remember when I was a college student, we would go out in the hallway and discuss free will. It's one of those kinds of classic collegiate experiences to talk about free will. I love talking about it, but I will say that there is kind of a dark side to that conversation of free will. There is a tendency to talk past one another when talking about free will. There's kind of a dismissive attitude, usually from the people who deny free will, but everyone's guilty of it to some degree about free will. So I will present, or I'll describe here some of my own thinking on free will. And I do that in full recognition that there's a spectrum of opinions on it. And I'm not trying to say one's better than the other. I'm just trying to put forward my view, and we can have a mature discussion about it. So I think it's important not to define free will as causelessness. I'll reserve that to the divine. We humans, things we do are caused. Now, if you think free will is a causeless cause, this is actually the term that Robert Sapolsky uses in a recent book on this question. Is it a causeless cause? Something that just happens devoid of any kind of physical laws or processes?
And let me pause you for a second.
Yep.
Should we define causality, or is that a
yes, I was going to get to that very point. I think our
because I agree with you. I agree with you. There is cause.
Right. So what I'm trying to set up the frame of this discussion the following: that free will is usually defined as something that's uncaused. Now, the people who talk about that don't actually tell us what it means to be caused. They don't define what causation actually is, and that is the deep and still not fully unanswered question. What is causation? Is it a useful concept? Is it a scientific concept at all? I just wanted to make the following more narrow point, which is I do not define free will in those terms. I think free will is completely compatible with causation. I think every decision that I take can be traced back in time. I made the decision because, as I said earlier, 58 years of experience plus what I eat for breakfast, etc. And I fully accept that. But they're still my decisions. That's what makes them. That's what makes it free will, in my view, is that the decisions come from my personality, beliefs, reasoning, etc. That's how I define free will. It's what would be philosophically called a compatibilist view of free will. Now, a lot goes into that. We have to start unpacking it. As you rightly point out, the concept of causation is the first thing that needs to be pulled out of this. And I have a whole chapter in the book on causation. It's difficult. What does it mean to cause something? Why is it difficult? Well, one reason it's difficult is that causation doesn't seem to be consistent with physics. So there's a tension there. Physics, the physical equations, dynamical laws is what we call them, tell you what the world will be given what the world is. If you define the world as particles and positions and momenta and so forth, it tells you where they'll be in a second from now. That tells you where they were yesterday. There's no sense of cause in that, though. There's correlation that the positions, momenta, etc., the particles tell you where they'll be or where they were. But we expect a bit more, at least when we use the word cause in everyday terms. We expect kind of more, one thing led to another. One thing impelled the other to occur. There's kind of a compulsion that occurs there. And that just isn't in physics. So philosophers, Bertrand Russell was the most famous. Early Bertrand Russell, actually, he revised his views as he got older. But the early 20-something Bertrand Russell said that causation just is a non-scientific, unscientific, and probably unphilosophical concept. And later, he came around to thinking it is a useful concept, and it's been actually a vast explosion of thinking in statistics, computer science, over the past 15 or so years, 20 years, on the notion of causation. Because here's what happened. If you deny cause, you get yourself into all sorts of rabbit holes and all sorts of dead ends. Does smoking cause cancer? Well, no, it doesn't, because it's correlated with cancer. It doesn't actually cause cancer.
Right.
Does human action, land use change, carbon dioxide emission cause climate change? Oh, no, it doesn't. I mean, you can, and maybe there's something to it. We have to be careful about ascribing cause when there isn't. We don't really have a good sense of it. But you don't want to overcorrect either. We're trying to act in the world. We're trying to be better humans. We're trying to save lives. We're trying to make the world a better place than what we inherited. That's kind of my personal goal in life, by the way, is to leave the world better than when I came into it. And to do that, we need to know how to act. And to know how to act, you need to know what causes what. So
I want to
causation is important.
I want to jump in here, but I don't want to cause a derailing. So hold your thought. Try not to get derailed by this, but I want to just bring in a couple of other thoughts. So first of all, with the complexity that we have today and the way that big issues are seeking to be solved, such as climate change, such as the economy, whatever the really big questions are, where people are getting onto ideological bandwagons and using labels and blaming and shaming other people, there's a lot of blaming of other people. There's a lot of assumption of ill will and bad intent. And my general view is everybody on the planet, with perhaps some very few psychopathic exceptions, and even they are not exceptions that prove this rule, or maybe they are exceptions that prove it. Everybody thinks that what they're doing is for the good of everybody, right? Even a mass murderer does what he does thinking he's somehow improving the world, right? So good intent is to be assumed rather than bad intent to be assumed, right? So when you're talking about now being a scientist and whatever field you're working on, I know there are sort of swarms of people or waves of people who are attributing ill will to people, but the problem is that the problems are so complex. There's collateral damage, right? There's unintended consequences, right? There's modern versions of bloodletting, which was assumed to be something that was helping people, right? Whether it's in the realm of COVID and COVID vaccines or COVID treatments or whatever it is, good, bad, I'm not coming down on any position, but the intent here is goodwill. And yet nonetheless, we sometimes create Frankenstein monsters, right?
I mean,
But
that is well put. Well put.
right. But what the next thing I wanted to get at is that some of the work that you're doing and that is now being done is being we are having some renaissance in philosophy and other things because the technology has advanced to the point where we can look at quantum computing, we can look at large data models. We are now engaging with reality in such a way that we're getting a different kind of feedback from reality than we had 10, 20 years ago. We're now creating at a level that our creations are teaching us something about those unintended consequences, about the fractal patterns that we're creating that are creating shockwaves through different systems. I'll stop there, but I think you know what I'm kind of getting at. So as you were talking about your work and progressing, you started talking about mathematics and computing. That's when I'm realizing we're getting to the point where some of the feedback that we're getting is forcing a reassessment on things that people had been able to just have vain imaginations and idle fancies about in the past.
And I think well put, and I'm very eloquently put. And I'm all in favor of dialogue on these difficult questions. And I assume good intent unless proved otherwise, or unless serially disappointed or whatever. But I'll assume good intent on people even I disagree with and who disagree with me. The point I'm making here is more maybe abstract, and that is whatever our intent, whatever our opinions about issues of the day or about what's going on in the world, we all have causal models. We all think that one thing causes another, and we think that therefore we can act on the thing that causes another. So those two things go together. We need to have a vision of the world as being something that causes lead to effects. There's kind of a mechanism or at least a logic to the world, and that we act on it. So there's two parts to that. And here's the thing, that kind of, and it seems like common sense, right? The world works in certain ways and we can act in the world to achieve certain ends. That seems obvious, but it wasn't reflected in the science of the 1950s and the philosophy of the 1950s. It was thought until, again, 20 years ago or so, widely thought within science, that there's no such thing as causes or effects, that the world just has these correlations in it. And there's no action you can take to affect their correlations. It's just there. And that was a very kind of enervating or neutralizing view of the world. That it's overly fatalistic, I think. And that happened in statistics. It happened with these debates over smoking. And that there was no cause of smoking, it's just correlations. Or it happened within physics even. That there's no reason the particle did this, it's just a correlation. So I think today, we've kind of come back to a more, maybe it's science, it's professors catching up with the kind of ordinary view on this, that there are causes in the world, there's actions we can take in the world, and our science needs to reflect that. And there's this whole thing called causal modeling that can do that. And now we don't have to, now we have a framework, an abstract framework, a mathematical, logical framework to debate these questions of the day. Does smoking cause cancer? We don't just have to throw up our hands and say it's only correlation. We can actually do controlled experiments. We can measure tar deposits or whatever the biologists do on this very question. We can climate change. There's something people get worked up about, but let's pull back from it a little bit. How do we overcome our disagreements? Well, we can do experiments. We can run models. We can debate. I mean, we can kind of work this through using causal thinking as our guide. This is our friend. Causal thinking is our friend. It's a way to pull back from debates that seem intractable and make progress on them. And physics is finally kind of catching up to that common sense view.
Interesting. So what was the turning point? And do we see anything? We talked earlier about somebody admitting they were wrong, right? It's not about admitting you were wrong in that sense, but it's about understanding what led to a false conclusion that might help one avoid false conclusions or might help one uncover a deeper error or a deeper bias, right? So what led to the turning of, what led to that? Was there a turning point, and was there some reflection about how we got to that sort of fatalistic view that no, it's all correlation?
Yeah, I think it's one of these kind of, and we see this a lot in I see this a lot in my own thinking. I see this a lot in our society, that there's a pendulum swinging back and forth. So, and people tend to have a good idea, maybe take it a little too far. So the good idea was, people tend to see cause where there isn't. People think the teddy bear or the inanimate object can speak or whatever. I'm making that one up, but the people read too much sometimes into the world, and we don't. So the scientists said we shouldn't read too much into the world. Okay, that's good, but then they went too far, and then they said we shouldn't read anything into the world. Okay, then let's pull back a little bit, and maybe the reason it was generational, just the passing of generations. A new generation comes along and maybe is able to see things in a different way. And I expect the kids today will see things differently from how we see it, and they'll get make their own mistakes, but they'll get some. They'll pick some of ours. So hopefully we'll have a net gain in that. So
I've sort of coined the term that we lurch forward from ditch to ditch, right? That's one of my Wadeisms, right?
But hopefully forward.
Well, we lurch forward from, but I'm also wondering, because I'm now suddenly remembering those articles by Michael Shermer, the skeptic, right? And he's talking about he used to talk about the rhinos in the tall grass or whatever, and pattern, correlation, pattern recognition bias. But to me, he was somebody I always did want to sort of talk to and, contest some of the things that he was saying, because some of the things he would say I disagreed with. Was he representing that view of, it's all just correlation? And I don't even know. I'm just now reflecting on what it was that was bothering me about some of his articles. Obviously, because he was kind of anti-God as well. That's another point, but.
Yeah, there's that. So I think it was a tendency among people who called themselves skeptics, often with a capital S. There's a skeptic society. Even I went to some skeptics meetings, and I think Michael was. I mean, first of all, years have gone by since I've talked to him. I'm sure he's more sophisticated in his thinking, because there's, again, been this general scholarly move, and I'm sure he's aware of and partaking in that. But often people who style themselves as skeptics will say it's only correlation, don't leap to conclusions too quickly. And they have a point.
That's
we
fair.
do, as humans, leap to conclusions without thinking. But on the other hand, you don't want to stop people from thinking things through either. So you need to find some middle ground. Maybe I should, part of my origin story is I'm really a middle ground seeker. I try to be just in my relationships.
Are you a middle child?
Daily
We didn't
life.
ask if you have siblings.
My brother, who's a statistician, by the way, is also, we're kind of, my dad was like this. My dad grew up in Washington, Eastern Washington State, but born in Missouri. So very much a middle ground seeking kind of person. I kind of think I inherited that from him. My mom's a bit more fiery, and I love that too. But he was always, we need to think about this. We need to think about that. He was always like one hand and the other hand kind of person. And I think that same way.
Very cool. Well, I hope I didn't derail you. You were getting into.
Yeah, we're totally derailed, aren't we?
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, I guess
you were talking about how causation and yeah.
So now there's this new thinking about causation that tries to do a few things. First, it tries to give us a framework or a kind of a deliberative process for acting in the world, for making decisions, for answering questions of the day that seem difficult to answer, but you can kind of break them down and use this framework called causal calculus or causal modeling. Usually you can detect it on slides and PowerPoint presentations, because there's lots of circles and lots of arrows, and people are trying to say, well, this causes this, but this other thing causes this. And it has a very complicated network structure, and you can kind of start to pick it apart. The world's complicated, we get it, but we should try to not be paralyzed by that either. And it also kind of reconciles causation with physics, because as I said, the laws of physics at their root don't seem to have cause in them. They just tell what the world will do given what the world is or what the world had been. But cause is something that comes in when we, agents, get involved. When the world is divided. Causation is a product of dividing the world into parts, the parts that interact with one another, and observers and agents who can act on those parts. The universe as a whole doesn't have cause. God doesn't see cause and effect in the universe. The universe just is. We humans, from our imperfect point of view in this way of thinking, impose cause and effect as categories on the world because they're useful to us. So you may disagree and not agree with the metaphysics of that, but it's undeniably useful pragmatically. There's whole textbooks. I've got a very nice textbook over here called Causality.
Yeah,
on this question.
I'm in deep reflection now because I'm digesting what you're saying and introducing it into my momentum, my trajectory, and it's causing some spin, some swirl.
Yeah, we live in what we call the temporal realm, and there's a reason we call it that. It's time oriented. It's time. Time is an element in our lives. The universe as a whole doesn't have a notion of time. It just is out there. It's a space-time structure. Time is something that we see from within, and likewise, cause is something we see from within. And a lot of these philosophical debates start to make more sense when you view, and I call it in my book, the inside-outside problem. When you start to realize there's an outside view, the objective so-called view, and an inside view, kind of the interior or the subjective view. And once you realize there's two equally valid views, and you try to understand how they're related to one another, you can start to slice through a lot of these problems.
Wow. I just read an article today on the upcoming election, and the parties and the president we had before, who's a new candidate, and the new candidate because of the current president backing out, and various realignment of people, endorsing this one versus that one, and the article described it in terms of a realignment on the issue of inside and outside.
Interesting.
And you were just saying that it has practical application, so I'm kind of smiling about that one. There's an insider's view and there's an outsider's view, and some of the alignments were more than Democrats versus Republicans or some of the other themes. It seemed like insiders versus outsiders is an upcoming topic.
Right. This comes up in so many contexts, not just political, not just scientific, but generally I'm just boiling it down to two. Of course, there are even more than two. Probably each of us has our own individual inside view. So there's 7 billion of those already, plus the hypothetical, or at least not hypothetical. It's real, but difficult to access outside view as well. Science.
I didn't remotely mean to get into politics, but that was just an interesting connection. What I do want to highlight, as we're running out of time, we're already over time, because this is just so fascinating. I am just learning so much, and I'm so energized by this discussion and what it portends, because I see these connections. But it does have very real implications if you process it. And what's coming to mind is actually 2 songs by the Talking Heads, right? Because art is a whole nother factor, right? If you're going to talk about a theory of everything, you have to throw a little art into it, right? But one is, that the song by David Byrne, where, well, actually they're all by David in Talking Heads, but he's saying, "I can feel my lifetime piling up," right? That's one of the lyrics. I can feel my lifetime piling up, this trajectory, this momentum idea. And this idea that you're on a course and you can't change it. And there's another song earlier from one of their earlier albums called Mind. It's from this album called Fear of Music. I don't know if you ever listened to that one. It's an amazing album from like 1979. It probably literally saved my life as I was graduating from high school, that album. But the song Mind had this lyric in it. "Religion won't change you. Science can't change you. Looks like I can't change you. What's the matter with you? I haven't got the slightest idea. I need something to change your mind."
Wow. Yeah, he's amazing.
And we all need things that can help change our mind. We all need things that can help open our mind. We all need things that can help us remain a seeker, right? Rather than getting locked in on what we think we've found. Because whatever, this gets back to that thing that Joe Atman talks about, is those false constructs through which we relate to reality, and they become, in biblical terms, a false god, a false idol, right? One of the commandments is, thou shalt have no other gods before me, right? Thou shalt not bow down to them to serve them. But these constructs, these ideas in our heads, they become our lens of looking at and interacting with the world. And I was in Leningrad at the time when Gorbachev was abducted. I've told this story before. And with the swirl of everything that was going on there, with the wall hadn't come down yet, but it was clearly that post World War II Cold War situation of the Soviet bloc and the Iron Curtain was unalterable. But here it was crumbling, and I was literally coming into Leningrad while tanks were coming from Moscow, right? Because Gorbachev had been abducted and there was a coup. And in that swirl, working with these young Western educated guys from Radio TV Leningrad, they were talking about how in this time of crisis, these satellite nations will return to Mother Russia. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Those people, they hate you to the depth of their toenails because of the subjugation that you opposed on, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, where I was working as a minister while I was in Europe. But what I realized in that moment was, getting back to this idea that, imagine good intent, everybody thinks they're right. Wherever they're coming from, this gets into why on the beginning of the show we'd like to talk about your creation story. Wherever we're coming from, we want to change the world for positive. We want to interact. We want to make a difference. We want to find a good place for us, for our families, for our loved ones. But we're convinced we're right. Whatever it is we're doing, we're convinced we're right. And we're not open to being challenged. We're not open to being confronted with reality. And this is, I guess, what Michael Shermer was getting at in those skeptic columns is, look, guys, you got to be open to the fact that you might be wrong.
I think that's the primordial, if you take nothing else away from our discussion, that aphorism, be open to the possibility you might be wrong. And actually, you probably are wrong in some way or other. I hate to break the news to you. I think, and I apply that to myself as well. You can't be right in everything. I mean, you're not a god. You shouldn't think you are.
Well, no, that would be
some way. And
there's an example in the Bible of Lucifer, the light bringer, who said, I will ascend to the throne of God. I will become like the Most High. That's where, Icarus flew too close to the sun and the wings melted because he wasn't a bird, right?
Right.
But I want to make a comment now for our religious audience, because there was a comment here earlier where somebody asked, what is reality? I'm looking for it now.
There's a lot of great comments. If we could get to them.
Yeah, thank you for everybody that's doing these comments. We are looking at them as we roll through our conversation here. But I'm looking for this. I can't find it because there's so many new ones. But what is reality, right? And perhaps some people are saying, whoa, wait a minute, time out, because faith, right? You need to have faith, and you don't want to let Satan come in and confuse you and cause you to doubt. But the problem is, to your point, we are not God, right? And sometimes we're so convinced of our rightness that even God can't convince us that we're wrong.
That's a problem, isn't it?
Yeah,
and it's hard. I'm not saying this is easy. It's not easy things to do, but I think dialogue, such as the one we're having, is the answer.
But this is the statement I wanted to make. True faith doesn't fear. Perfect love casts out fear. So we don't need to be afraid of the discussion. We don't need to be afraid of the possibility of considering that we might be wrong, because the Bible also says, yea, even though I walk through the valley of death, right? God is with me. So if you're scared of the conversation, you're scared of having a conversation with people you might fear are more intelligent than you, and that they might, cause you to lose faith or be swayed in your beliefs, have trust in God that he can keep you safe in that discussion as you explore and learn and grow.
So I hope in a future session we can talk about time, because that question has come up a few times, so to speak.
Since we're out of
And
time today.
much to be said about time. Time's a tricky subject because the universe as a whole doesn't seem to have it. And yet, of course, we experience time. And how do you reconcile those? It's similar to the free will discussion. Um, there's something that looks differently from a subjective point of view than from the outside point of view.
Well, George,
I do think, by the way, we have free will, but okay.
If you're at all willing, I will be dragging you back to this show to continue this discussion. So we should have time to talk about time in a future episode.
It's interesting. Maybe this is one thought I wanted to share with you. The question of free will is actually one of the reasons that I found myself in disagreement with the Catholic Church and ultimately had to move on from it. I went through CCD class as a kid, I've gone through all the sacraments, but I had a lot of trouble with at least the Catholic, or at least maybe my Monsignor's view on free will. Because I think free will requires that we have meaningful choices. So it isn't just that we're choosing God over the alternative. It's that we have, because that's not really a choice in essence. That's it's kind of preordained what we should do in that case. Free will, it should be more liberating. We should have choices, and that whatever choice we make should be defensible in some way. So I'd like to think I'm kind of cycling back to some of my earlier spiritual beliefs through my thinking on free will.
Thank you. I appreciate that reflection, and I think all of us need to again be open to questioning some of those things that are delivered, especially by organized religion. To be honest, I resigned from the ministry in 1995 to separate my faith from my paycheck because I was in a situation where it was unethical for me because I didn't fully believe things that I was being told to teach other people, and I was being paid to teach those things that I didn't fully believe in, or there was at least enough nuance with some of the things that I was being told to teach. And if you think about all the Christian churches and denominations out there, they all have slight different variations. To the degree that you're told, and we all have to make some compromises. Nobody's pure and nothing's perfect. But we should be open to considering, that what we have received, what we've been taught, may not be correct.
Agreed. Here.
Continuing exploration, and that's why I love Scientific American, and George, why it's been such an honor to have you here. I do hope we can have you back in the very near future to continue diving into free will, agency, and time, and any other topics that you felt were not fully explored. Is there anything? We'll come back in a minute. I'm going to go to one more quick commercial break to let people know who's going to be here next week. And then we'll come right back and wrap this one up. So don't go anywhere. Stay tuned. We'll be coming back with final thoughts from George Musser in a minute.
Out of economics. Our economic problems have become a tool for political manipulation. But is there a way to break free from the old paradigms? Introducing More Than Laissez-Faire, a revolutionary textbook that challenges today's financial principles. Economics is more than just data. It's a science of human action, a philosophy that respects the human spirit. Bruce's groundbreaking model uses the methodology of subjectivism, starting simply and growing into a complex, dynamic framework that integrates all economic theory, providing real solutions to today's economic challenges. Discover the alternative that the world has been waiting for. More Than Laissez-Faire, a macroeconomic textbook alternative by Bruce Korber. Available now.
So next week we will have Bruce back on the show for the second appearance to talk about the macroeconomic view of his divine economy theory. It was a wonderful talk having him here last time, and I can't wait. And that's why I called you Bruce at the beginning of the show, because I was reviewing that video. But George, It's been such an honor and a pleasure to talk about the themes in your book, to talk about your life, to talk about your experience with Scientific American. What did we leave unsaid today that you feel is important to leave our audience with?
Oh, wow. I mean, we brought up a lot of things and probably didn't really tie any of them off, so we'll have to revisit this. But I will say, people who have questions, and there's a lot of them in the column that's kind of run down my screen here, just Google me and at me on whatever social media platform. I don't use TikTok, but pretty much I'm on all the others. So you can PM me or public message me if you want. And I want to hear from the person who was on Western Union, who worked at Western Union about telegrams in the 90s. A couple of people asked me to discuss the nature of time. I can elaborate on thinking about free will or causation as well, one-on-one. So feel free to reach out to me.
Thank you, Bruce. Really appreciate your down-to-earthness, your accessibility. It's been just a pleasure and an honor. And I'd like to just say, on a personal note, those are signs for me of somebody who truly is connected to reality, to the divine, and is just willing to provide service in love to mankind. And I see that coming through, and I applaud your ability to explore the heights of those scientific theories and those high concepts, desire to make them accessible to others, and then give of yourself and your time to further share them and help people discuss some of the things that you've discovered. And it's just wonderful. It's truly wonderful.
Well, it's really been my pleasure, and that's the nicest anything anyone's ever said to me. So I'm much obliged to you.
And I can see here the audience is looking forward to having you back. So don't worry, we'll announce that when the time comes. But for now, everyone have a wonderful week, and we'll see you same time next week, 8 p.m. Central Time, for Created in the Image of God. Until then, may God be with you. And